It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, Episode 39, Jimmy Carter, the Peanut Farmer. When Jimmy Carter comes up in conversation, I hear one of three reactions. Jimmy Carter? What a chump! He was the worst president in modern history. Jimmy Carter, what a humanitarian! Did you know the guy's built thousands of homes through Habitat for Humanity? Or I'll hear both of those sentiments back to back. As I've dug into Carter, another picture has come into focus, and it explains a lot. Jimmy Carter is an engineer who learned how to smile. When in office, Carter will often focus on the kind of forward-looking, min-maxing work that engineers delight in. What does the math and science say? Let's do that. But he'd also failed to develop a loyal constituency anywhere. His smile was fake. His personality was prickly. He was confident he knew what to do, but he didn't know how to bring anyone along with him. And the result was a failed presidency, rich in avoidable gaffes and missed opportunities. But it was also more than that, because the few things he got right had dividends that paid off well after he left office. James Earl Carter Jr. was born on October 1st, 1924, in a hospital in Tiny Plains, Georgia, population 650. And, fun fact, he was the first president born in a hospital. James, who soon went by Jimmy, was the oldest of 4 children, and childhood wasn't easy. His father, James Earl Carter Sr., he went by Earl, and his mother, Bessie, owned a farm that featured no running water, no electricity, no insulation, and no mechanized equipment. There wasn't much fancy back then, just slop jars and outhouses, hand-pumped wells, and Jim Crow segregation. Oh boy, was there segregation. The Carters did not work their own farm. Black families who lived in nearby shacks, they worked it. Jimmy's dad, Earl, profited from it and used those profits to fund a career as a tinkerer and a merchant. But there was not hate in the Carter household. Jimmy wasn't taught to look down on black families. He was encouraged to befriend them. Though he never did question it when, on trips to catch a movie in town, his black friends had to sit in the colored sections of the train and the theater. That's just how life was for children in the South. But as Jimmy grew older, he wanted to leave the South and see the world, and he decided his best ticket to doing that was to attend the Naval Academy at Annapolis. It took a little effort getting in. Carter's congressman didn't approve him on first or second try, but Carter was nothing if not a hard, persistent worker, and he kept his nose to the grindstone until he made it into the academy. And that's when this young man who yearned to get out and see the world realized his future wife had been right under his nose the whole time. Jimmy's mom was a nurse, and when Jimmy was 3 years old, she brought him to see a newborn she delivered in town. That baby, 1 day old, was Rosalind, Jimmy's future wife. Years later, when Jimmy was at Annapolis, Rosalind spotted his picture on the wall of her friend, Jimmy's sister's, house. And Roz thought Jimmy looked handsome. So Rosalind asked the sister to set Roz and Jimmy up on a date. That first date went great, and before long they were talking marriage. They tied the knot on July 7th, 1946, and remained married the rest of their lives, a 77-year marriage that only ended with Rosalind's death in 2023. They had 4 children, and Rosalind later made a name for herself as an active First Lady, traveling abroad as an unofficial ambassador of her husband's, maintaining her own policy staff, a first for First Ladies, and even attending cabinet meetings. Her pet causes included treating mental health like a disease instead of a stigma, and childhood vaccinations. Her work to make vaccines a requirement for school in 33 states has saved thousands, if not tens of thousands, of lives. Now married, Carter graduated from Annapolis and spent the next 7 years in the Navy, where no experience was more impactful than the job interview he had with Admiral Hyman Rickover. Rickover was an engineer who had reached his lofty rank by developing the technology that ran America's nuclear submarines. By some account, this one man put the American nuclear navy 20 years ahead of its Soviet counterparts. And Carter, also an engineer, wanted to work for Rickover. But Rickover's interviews were legendarily difficult. If a candidate was engaged, Rickover would tell them to call their fiancée and end the engagement. Then he would kick them out if they started dialing. To see how candidates handled stress, he would ask them to open windows that were nailed shut, or make them sit on chairs with shorter front legs so that they were constantly sliding out of their seats. He once gestured to a janitor out the window and told his interviewee, "I'm going to shoot either you or that janitor. Who should it be?" And when the stammering interviewee said, "Shoot me, not the janitor," Rickover yelled, "Wrong! You are a highly trained nuclear engineer. That's more valuable to the Navy than a janitor." The dude was nuts. Jimmy Carter's 2-hour interview, seated in one of Rickover's famously uneven chairs, included a slew of very specific questions, but only one was life-changing. Rickover asked Carter how he had finished at Annapolis. 59th in a class of 820, Carter said. Rickover paused for a moment, then asked, "Did you always do your best?" And Carter started to answer, "Yes, sir," but caught himself, gulped, and said, "No, sir, I didn't always do my best." Rickover looked him directly in the eyes for what felt like an eternity, and then asked, "Why not?" 7 decades later, Carter still mulled over the question, why hadn't he done the best? From that point forward, he would always try. Carter got the job, but only served on Rickover's team for 11 months before receiving a phone call that changed his life. His father had gone in for cancer surgery, but the surgery had failed. Earl Carter, 59 years old, had been sent home to die. Jimmy flew home to be with his dad, and you know the scene at the end of It's a Wonderful Life, when the whole town shows up for George Bailey during his moment of need? That's what happened for Earl Carter during his last days on Earth. Jimmy had never really realized it, but Earl had used his wealth and position to help his community, lending money, giving gifts, working in community organizations, and they all came now to see him and give thanks for what he'd done. But the biggest generosity was saved for right here. On his deathbed, Earl forgave the debt of anyone who owed him money, and then he died. Jimmy was deeply moved by it all, and left with deep questions. Will anybody care when I die? And also, who's going to run the family business? His younger siblings and mom lacked interest or capacity, so in a moment, Jimmy radically changed the trajectory of his life. He resigned from the Navy and moved back to Plains, Georgia to run the family farm. Rosalind was not happy when she was told the decision had been made without her. For the next 9 years, Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer. He nearly failed his first year. The farm's total year-one profits were just $280, and the family moved into public housing. But he made it, and the business took off from there. His political prospects did not lag far behind. Jimmy Carter was a joiner. To help sell peanuts, he traveled the state and joined every organization he could. And his travel created a ready constituency. In 1962, he decided it was time to join the Georgia State Senate. Without consulting Rosalind, again, this is kind of a theme in their life, Carter filed his papers and launched his campaign, winning only after suing his opponent for committing fraud and having the election's results overturned in court. Yikes! Carter was a peculiar politician. He took a speed reading class and pledged to personally read every bill that came through Congress, something that only one other senator even attempted. This made him influential, since most of the other senators didn't know what was in the legislation they were voting for. Carter was at his strongest when getting into the weeds on legislation and discussing the finer points. But he was lost when it came to softly influencing his peers. Carter was not a socialite. He was a loner, straight arrow, Boy Scout type. Nobody was going to vote on something because Carter asked them to. After 4 years in the state Senate, Jimmy Carter, aged 42, decided to run for governor. He lost his first bid, and the reason why is kind of sad. 1966 was peak civil rights era. The March on Selma had occurred just a year earlier, and LBJ had passed civil rights in 1964 and voting rights in 1965. But the South did not accept these laws. A campaign called Massive Resistance had launched, where segregationists used violence, bureaucracy, and politics to, well, massively resist implementing the laws. So when Jimmy ran for governor in 1966, the Democratic primary pitted him against a political newcomer named Lester Maddox, a restaurant owner whose only claim to fame was chasing 3 black kids out of his restaurant with an axe handle during a civil rights march. Guess who won? The racist Maddox won the Democratic nomination and lost the general election to the Republicans, but his opponent had only won a plurality, not a majority of the vote in the general. In Georgia, that meant the election went to the House of Representatives, where a segregationist majority put the racist Maddox in the governor's mansion despite him losing the general election. That is massive resistance in a peanut shell. Jimmy Carter was devastated by this turn of events, and this is when he got religious. Searching for meaning, he discovered evangelical Christianity and declared himself a born-again Christian. Having found his God, Carter was ready to find his way back to politics, and he spent the next 3 years laying the groundwork for, and then waging, a campaign for governor. Georgia law banned incumbent governors from seeking re-election, so Carter knew that instead of facing the racist Maddox in 1970, he would primary against Carl Sanders, a former governor famous for bringing the NFL, NBA, and MLB to Atlanta. Sanders' only weakness was that he was a moderate on race, which probably makes now a good time to talk about Carter's stance on civil rights. He didn't have one. I'm not kidding. Carter, to the best of his ability, ducked the issue of civil rights for the entirety of his Georgia political career. He didn't oppose it. He didn't support it. He just tried to avoid it. Why? Years earlier, Carter had taken his family on a vacation to Mexico, only to return home and discover his business had lost most of his clients. Neighbors who thought Carter wasn't sufficiently supportive of the massive resistance campaign against civil rights had spread rumors across Georgia that Carter hadn't taken his family to Mexico, he had taken them to a communist training camp in Alabama instead. Carter had to drive door to door across the state with Mexican receipts to prove he had not been at a communist training camp and win back his business. So it might have been fear that kept Carter from supporting civil rights, but it was ambition that shaped his approach to it during his second governor's race. Running against the popular former governor Sanders, whose only weakness was the perception that he was weak on race. Carter's strategy to win was to court the racists. Now, Carter didn't portray himself as an outspoken racist or segregationist to do this. He didn't have to. All he had to do was dog whistle to show the segregationists that he might be on their side when they knew Sanders was not. Carter would pepper his speeches with terms like Georgia's heritage, local control, law and order, and respect for Governor Wallace. The Alabama governor, who was so racist he'd run for president on a third-party platform of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So when Carter said he had respect for Governor Wallace, segregationists knew exactly what he meant. Carter balanced these dog whistles with support for middle-class issues like education, and he held quiet meetings with black leaders like Martin Luther King Sr., Daddy King, which helped expand his coalition across the state. The defining moment of the race may have come when a picture of Sanders celebrating in a locker room with black athletes was published. The Carter campaign made sure everyone knew Sanders was a friend of blacks, and Carter won the primary with 60% of the vote, and later he won the governorship by a landslide. But his segregationist supporters were in for a surprise when Inauguration Day rolled around. The thing is, Carter's wealthiest supporter and closest advisor was an eccentric Jewish guy named David Raban. And when I say eccentric, I mean David was always wearing flight suits and personally flying Carter to all his political events in his twin-prop plane, landing and taking off from dirt strips. Toward the end of the race, Carter was flying with David when Carter asked, "You've done so much for me, but you never asked for anything. What can I do for you?" David thought about it for a bit, then said he'd like Carter to declare it was time to end racial discrimination once and for all in his inaugural address. Carter's advisors thought the idea was crazy, but Carter agreed. And on the day he was sworn in as governor, he declared,
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over. No poor, rural, weak, or black person should ever have to bear the additional burden of being deprived of the opportunity of an education, a job, or simple justice.
Segregationist Democrats were so shocked that they walked out on the speech before it was over, and Carter's ability to accomplish anything as governor was severely curtailed. Segregationists began calling him Georgia's Hitler. But minority leaders in the state thought the real Carter was finally coming out. As one black state senator said, quote, "I understand why he ran that kind of ultra-conservative campaign. I don't believe you can win this state without being a racist." But there may have been another reason for the about-face. Carter was already thinking of the next step of the political ladder, the presidency. And he knew that such a statement from a Southern governor would capture national attention. Of all the governors sworn in 1971, only Carter made national front-page news the following day. And the rest of his governorship, starting from day one, was truly a campaign for the presidency. Jimmy Carter's 1976 presidential campaign is one of the greatest long-shot political campaigns in U.S. history. I'll get into more details when I interview Carter biographer Jonathan Alter in my next episode, but Carter realized that if there was ever a year for an outsider to win the presidency, 1976 was it. Watergate and Ford's pardon of Nixon had soured the nation on Washington politics. So when Carter started running a new kind of campaign, sleeping at supporters' homes to save money, appearing with bandit country stars like Willie Nelson and Jerry Jeff Walker on stage, that worked for people. When the Iowa caucus rolled around, undecided won, but Carter placed a surprising second. His campaign snaked through the North and South, picking up key wins through a mix of luck and insight. He nearly imploded after telling a journalist, quote, "I see nothing wrong with ethnic purity being maintained. I would not force racial integration of a neighborhood by government action," which, whoa. But his campaign was saved when Daddy King held a rally for Carter where he said not to judge a man for a slip of the tongue. After this, the black vote would be Carter's most reliable bloc. Add it all up, and Carter had enough delegates to wrap up the nomination before the Democratic convention. The only drama was who he would pick as his vice president, and this is funny. That news, the VP, being Walter Mondale, was broken by a children's publication called Children's Express. Its 12-year-old reporter explained, "My main advantage is that adults don't think children listen or understand." The harmless leak of the VP is humorous, but an interview Carter gave to Playboy nearly tanked his campaign again. Playboy was one of the most popular publications in the country in 1976, so Carter thought an interview might help him come off as a little more hip. He was asked if his religious views on adultery, homosexuality, and other victimless crimes would make him, quote, a rigid, unbending president. Carter replied that Jesus set some pretty impossible standards, but as for himself, quote, I have looked on women with lust. I have committed adultery in my heart many times. But that doesn't mean I condemn someone who not only looks on a woman with lust, but who leaves his wife and shacks up with somebody out of wedlock. Even in the sexually permissive 70s, that I've committed adultery in my heart bit caused a firestorm. Late-night comedians would not let it go. Signs with Carter for Playmate of the Year or Smile if you're horny began popping up at his rallies. And by some estimates, Carter lost 10% of his support nationally after the interview. The election tightened down the stretch, but Carter narrowly triumphed. 50 to 48% in the popular vote and 297 to 240 in the Electoral College. In 20 states, the winning margin was less than 5%. And so, on January 20th, 1977, the peanut farmer, one-time Georgia governor, and political outsider Jimmy Carter was sworn in as the 39th President of the United States. He was 52 years old. In a show of how incorruptible he promised to be, he sold the family peanut farm before entering office. But what did the world and the country look like when Carter became president? Let's look around. Domestically, American distrust of government institutions was at a low that it frankly has never recovered from. The percent of Americans who said they trusted government to do what is right most or all of the time had fallen from 77% at the start of LBJ's administration to 62% at the start of Nixon's to 35% when Jimmy Carter entered office. It has never passed 60% since, and for those who are counting, it currently sits around 16%. Woof! Carter also inherited a struggling economy that would be his undoing. Internationally, the Vietnam War was truly finally over, and the Cold War was experiencing a brief thaw. But as relations between the Soviet Union and the West eased, relations between the English and the Irish deteriorated. Northern Ireland, which then and now is part of the United Kingdom, was basically host to a low-level war throughout the 70s as the Irish revolutionaries battled British insurgents. The struggle did not end until 1998. And in Panama, remember that canal that Theodore Roosevelt built? Well, it was still owned and operated by the U.S. government, but the people of Panama wanted it back. Simmering tension threatened to break into guerrilla warfare if it was not addressed. But if Panama threatened, at least Jimmy Carter had nothing to fear in Iran, where the CIA assured Carter that there was zero risk of revolution. Yep, nothing to worry about there. Don't even worry about it. So, let's turn our attention toward Panama. If you remember back to episode 26 on Theodore Roosevelt, the United States had long wanted to build and control a canal across Central America. Such a canal would shorten the distance from the Atlantic to the Pacific by 8,000 miles and empower the American Navy to easily deploy to either ocean. The only problem was that the land had been controlled by Colombia, and the Colombian government was playing hardball. So, in 1903, the United States helped the people of Panama gain their independence. All we asked for in return was a simple treaty, no big deal, granting us the land to build a canal and control of that canal into perpetuity. Neat. For the next 75 years, most Americans thought of the canal as American territory, like Puerto Rico or the Samoas. But it wasn't, because the thing is, Panama had never formally relinquished sovereignty. and the people of Panama were starting to get resentful. I mean, here was this canal that a decent slice of global trade was passing through. Today, it's 6% of global trade. Not sure what it was back then. That is 6% of all global trade. And the people of Panama were especially annoyed that the profits of managing the canal were going to the United States, not them. In 1964, this simmering tension had boiled over when Panama broke diplomatic relations with Washington and 3 days of riots broke. President LBJ had responded by sending U.S. troops and agreeing to renegotiate the Canal Treaty that got trade moving through the canal again, but those negotiations, meandering through the Johnson, Nixon, and Ford administrations, yielded zero results. By the time Carter became president, that simmering Panamanian resentment threatened to boil over again. Many feared a terrorist attack on the canal could close the region to global trade and turn Panama into America's next Vietnam. Carter's negotiators landed on a 2-treaty plan to resolve the predicament. The first treaty would call for joint U.S. Panamanian operation of the canal until an official transfer of control at the end of the century. A second treaty would declare the canal a neutral zone that the United States had no right to intervene in militarily. But would the American Senate approve it? It didn't look promising. Polls showed only 1/3 of Americans thought the canal should be turned over, and opposition candidates, including Ronald Reagan, were already campaigning against it, saying, quote, "We built it, we paid for it, it's ours, and we're going to keep it." Which is a catchy line, but Carter knew that if the treaties failed to pass the U.S. Senate, a guerrilla war in Panama would almost certainly be the outcome. To make sure it got across the finish line, Carter telegrammed every senator asking them to withhold criticism until they read the deal, and all but 2 of the most conservative Republicans agreed. This helped prevent the opposition from building momentum. Even better, Gerald Ford, who Carter had just defeated for the presidency, came out in support of the treaty, making it a bipartisan quest. Ronald Reagan initially promised to support it too, but he soon broke that vow with vaguely racist language about how the Panamanians were too immature to run the canal and outright lies that the treaties would let them nationalize it overnight. Given the intense pressure against it, some senators, like Barry Goldwater, privately told Carter that he was doing the right thing, but refused to support him publicly or vote with him. When Carter thanked another senator for doing the right thing and voting for the treaties, the senator replied that any more right things would cost him his seat in the Senate. To pass the treaty, 67 of 100 senators were needed. The second treaty, neutrality, was the more popular of the two. It narrowly passed the Senate 68-32 on March 16, 1978. But the second treaty, the handover treaty, was still a heck of a fight. To win the support of one senator, Carter read the guy's book in a single night so he could discuss it with him the following day. Then he told the senator, "Oh, you are so wise, I want to meet with you on a weekly basis to get your advice on the challenges that America faces." The appeased senator voted for the treaty, and then Carter never talked to him again. The net result of Carter's efforts was for the second treaty to pass with the same vote as the first, 68-32. 16 Republicans voted with Carter and 10 Democrats voted against. The canal would be handed over on December 31st, 1999. But there was one more freakout. After the treaty was signed, the Panamanian president made an offhand comment that if the American Senate hadn't approved the treaties, he had ordered his military to blow up the canal. And then he started shipping arms to leftist rebels in Nicaragua. The reason this threatened to blow apart the deal is that the House of Republicans still had to pass a budget to fund joint operations of the canal. And if they refused to fund joint operation of the canal, the treaty would be dead in the water. Carter had to go to bat with all 535 members of Congress to narrowly save the treaties. In September of 1979, Congress passed the money for joint operation of the canal by a margin of 2 votes. Ronald Reagan, who had so vigorously opposed the treaties, later kept them in place. They likely averted war with Panama, but they cost Democrats and centrist Republicans dearly. 13 Democratic senators lost their seats for supporting Carter on the canal. Months after the Panama Treaty passed, Carter tackled an even greater international challenge, negotiating peace between Israel and Egypt. U.S. relations with Israel date back to 1948, when Harry Truman became the first world leader to recognize the Jewish state, signing the paperwork so quick that the name for the country was still blank. Within hours of Israel's creation, 4 Arab nations attacked, vowing to kill all the Jews from the river to the sea. But Israel survived that war, and the next war, and the war after that. In the span of 25 years, 4 wars were fought between Israel and its neighbors, whose armies would attack, be defeated, and then flee, leading to more land being captured by the Israelis. By 1976, Israel had captured the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. The result of these repeated Arab defeats, and perhaps influenced by Israel's development of nuclear weapons, was that Egypt's charismatic dictator, Anwar Sadat, decided war just wasn't working. He wanted the Sinai Peninsula back, and Israel wanted peace. He'd give diplomacy a try and see what happened. Sadat kicked off his diplomatic game with an audacious move for an Arab leader. In 1977, Sadat told Egypt's parliament that he would be willing to visit Israel. And if that doesn't sound like a big deal, ask yourself, when's the last time you heard of an Arab leader visiting Israel? You haven't, because it never happens. Israel's Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, extended a formal invitation, and Sadat's 3-day visit to Israel became the start and nearly the end of negotiations. Even as Sadat worked his charms on Israel officials, the governments of Syria, Iraq, and Libya called for Sadat to be assassinated, and Arab Americans criticized him for visiting the Jewish state, which might be why Arab leaders never visit Israel. Peace seemed stalled, but a spark had been lit, and Carter was determined to fan the flame. So, he did something crazy. Against the advice of his advisors, Carter invited Sadat and Begin to a presidential retreat called Camp David for 3 days of negotiation. The goal was nothing less than an enduring peace between Israel and Egypt. The thing is, presidents almost never get directly involved in negotiations like this, because if the negotiations fail, it will look like the president failed. Usually it's someone at the State Department doing all the legwork, and then the president just shows up at the signing ceremony. But not Carter. He was going to be in the thick of it. On September 17th, 1978, the Camp David negotiations began. Aside from Carter, the 2 star personalities of the negotiation were Sadat and Begin, who had more in common than they'd likely care to admit. Sadat was a descendant of slaves and a former revolutionary terrorist against British rule. Begin was a Polish immigrant who had lost his family in the Holocaust and also a former revolutionary terrorist against British rule. And neither wanted peace. Sure, Sadat wanted the Sinai back, but all that death threat business had cooled his interest in peace. His goal at Camp David was to charm Carter and turn the U.S. into an ally against Israel. And Begin agreed to come because he didn't want to lose U.S. as an ally. When the 3 leaders met at Camp David, Sadat opened with a 90-minute proposal that would have given Egypt everything it wanted and Israel nothing it wanted, which is not a great start. On the 3rd day, this was supposed to be the last day, it would not be, Carter asked Begin to offer Sadat a concession for showing courage to visit Jerusalem. Begin said it took courage on his part as well to invite Sadat, who had launched the unprovoked 1973 Yom Kippur War, striking Israel while the country's Jews were still in synagogue. Sadat brushed away the surprise attack on the holiest Jewish holiday as a strategic deception, and a shouting match erupted that nearly ended the conference, with both ministers headed for the door. But Carter leapt up and physically stood in the doorway to block them from leaving. After that blow-up, Carter took a new tact. Sadat and Begin would no longer be allowed in the same room together. Instead, Carter would start each round of discussions by writing a document he thought each side could agree with. He would take that document to one and then the other, rounding off any rough edges and disagreements until both sides aligned on the document, and then Carter would write another. Israeli settlements in the Sinai quickly became a sticking point. A handful of Israeli settlements had been built in the Sinai since Israel captured it. Begin did not want to force the settlers out, but Sadat said they had to go with Egyptian control. So Carter asked Sadat, "Would you allow Jews from any nation to live in Cairo?" "Of course I would," Sadat said. So then Carter asked, "Why not let a small number of Jews live in the Sinai?" Sadat replied, "Some things in the Middle East are not logical. The Jews would all have to go." Several more times, one side or the other packed up and ready to go, only for Carter's personal pleas to convince them to stay. Would Begin really throw away the chance for peace over a few settlements in the Sinai? Was Sadat willing to rupture U.S.-Egyptian relations and be seen as a failure? The answer was always no, and so the negotiations would resume. And somehow, despite all the mistrust and misaligned goals, a peace agreement began to take shape. Egypt would get the Sinai Peninsula back. Israeli settlers would have to leave. Egypt would receive American economic aid, and Israel would get peace. This is a pretty sweet deal for Egypt. You might see most of that as good stuff for them, but the Egyptian street hated it. Egypt's foreign minister resigned in protest. If Egypt had been a democracy, there is no way this deal would have been accepted. It was only possible because Sadat was a dictator. An excited Carter organized a signing ceremony in Washington to celebrate the diplomatic triumph. But just before the signing, the agreement nearly collapsed again. Sadat wanted the treaty to include a letter saying East Jerusalem belonged to the Palestinians. And Begin again threatened to walk. That's not part of the deal. Carter only convinced Begin to stay by meeting with them personally and presenting a picture of them from the summit that was intended to be a gift for Begin's grandchildren, and then saying, "I'd hope to write, this is where your grandfather and I brought peace to the Middle East." And that really made it hit home to Begin that right there, right then, he could put the two countries on a path toward peace or a path toward war. Carter then suggested they amend the offensive letters. Let's, just get rid of that whole thing about East Jerusalem being Palestinian. And Begin agreed. The Camp David Accords were signed. But they weren't yet approved. Each government had to sign off for that to happen. Every Arab head of state but Egypt met in Baghdad to denounce the deal and put pressure on Sadat to abandon it. And in Israel, Begin's support for it wavered as well. 6 months after signing the accord, Carter traveled to the Middle East to save it from defeat. He visited Sadat first, who quickly patched all concerns and said Carter could negotiate on his behalf with the Israelis. Then Carter visited Israel, where Begin was again intransigent. So, at the advice of an aide, Carter went over Begin's head and addressed the entire Israeli cabinet. Carter found everyone in the cabinet more receptive to the accords than Begin. And then Carter addressed the Israeli Knesset, their parliament. Carter learned the Israelis had two main concerns. One, Egyptian forces in the Gaza Strip could be a security threat if they ever broke the accords and attacked, as they had done 3 times previously. And Israel feared for its energy security. It had built oil derricks in the Sinai. Without them, Israel had no oil. Carter said the U.S. would guarantee Israel's oil supply and that he could convince Sadat to keep Egyptian troops out of Gaza, which Sadat didn't want anyway. This and a final personal entreaty to Begin did the trick. Sadat signed onto the amendments, and the Israeli cabinet voted 15-0 to adopt the accords. Against all odds and overcoming all obstacles, peace had been found. But one final tragedy did remain. The Arab world never forgave Sadat for making peace with Israel. Egyptian students were evicted from other Arab countries, and the Arab League closed its office in Cairo to show its displeasure. Then, on October 6, 1981, 2 years after the deal's signing, Sadat was assassinated by Islamic Jihad members angry at him for making peace. But even through that, the peace survived. After fighting 4 wars in the first 25 years of Israel's existence, Egypt and Israel have not fought once in the 43 years since Camp David. The Camp David Accords are Carter's greatest triumph. But within a year, they would be eclipsed by his greatest tragedy, a tragedy in Iran. You may remember that back in 1953, President Eisenhower approved a CIA op to overthrow Iran's democratically elected government and install a Shah or king who would rule as a tyrant but keep Iran's oil flowing to the West. Well, the people of Iran certainly still remembered it. American involvement in that coup was a poorly kept secret, and Iranians resented Americans for the decades of cruel dictatorial rule they had suffered since. The Shah's secret police tortured and murdered any who opposed him, and the wealth of the country flowed into his palaces or Western coffers instead of to the Persians in the streets. The only dissidents who survived were the ones who fled, like a 39-year-old cleric named Khomeini, who preached against the Shah from France. But some nut job in France isn't going to topple the Shah, right? As late as 1977, Jimmy Carter visited Iran and gave a toast, quote, "Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability and one of the more troubled areas of the world." Oops! Less than a year later, 20,000 Iranians marched to protest the Shah's brutality, and the Shah's police massacred 2,000 of them. This shocking crackdown pushed secular Iranians into the revolutionary camp, and the country started to spiral. But Carter's advisors were divided and distracted. They were busy with Camp David, Chinese relations, nuclear arms treaties. Iran was not a high priority. So they put out a statement supporting the Shah and let that be that. But that was not that, because the one thing Carter's team did not know was that the Shah had cancer. His resolve was growing weak, and cassette tapes of sermons by Khomeini were being smuggled into Iran, encouraging revolution. As 1978 turned to 1979, Carter's advisors were coming to the conclusion that the Shah needed to appoint a moderate prime minister and leave Iran if a pro-Western regime was to survive. On January 16th, the Shah fled. But still, Carter's administration was distracted by other matters, so distracted that it failed to block Khomeini from returning. That would prove a mistake. On February 1st, 1979, Khomeini was raptured home by huge, rapturous crowds. There were many different dissident factions around at this point, but Khomeini's was clearly the largest and most passionate. And then things really started to go sideways. On February 11th, a Persian mob trapped Iranian military officers and 26 senior American leaders in a bunker, which could have been the end of them. They could have killed them all. But Khomeini arranged for them to be released after a few hours. 3 days after that, a mob attacked the U.S. Embassy, but the Marines repelled them without firing a shot. And this might be why the Americans thought their embassy personnel were safe as the country continued to fall apart around them. The Americans wanted to think a new government would emerge that they could work with, and they had reasons to be hopeful. The United States had frozen Iranian assets, and Iran wanted those back. It wanted to be recognized, and it wanted expats returned to face Khomeini's version of justice, typically a bullet to the head. The United States wanted to maintain secret listening posts on the Soviet border and to get that Iranian oil flowing again. Khomeini might be executing generals and solidifying his hold on the country, but he can be worked with, right? But then the Shah became a problem. The problem was that nobody wanted him. After fleeing Iran, the Shah had landed in Egypt, then Morocco, then the Bahamas, then Mexico. What he really wanted was refuge in the United States, but Carter didn't want him, knowing it would upset the Iranian street. And when an aide suggested letting the Shah in, Carter asked, "What are you guys going to advise me to do if they overrun our embassy and take our people hostage?" Which might be why Carter upped security at the embassy and downsized staff from 1,100 to 70. But the Shah had rich and powerful friends. Conservative leaders like Kissinger, Nixon, and Ford dreamed of putting the Shah back in power, and bankers who had lost millions in the revolution thought the Shah could make them whole again. They sent letters to the White House saying the Shah would succumb to his cancer within days if he wasn't allowed into the United States, saying that Mexico lacked the diagnostic equipment he needed. That was actually all a lie, just a ruse to get Carter's bleeding heart to let the Shah into New York. And it worked. And once word got out that the Shah was secretly being treated in New York, any moderates left in the Iranian government were ousted as the Iranian street went wild with fury. A group of radical Islamist Iranian students in Tehran convinced themselves that the Shah was not in New York for medical treatment. He was in New York to plan a coup, just like the one that had once put him in power. But how could they prove it? Well, maybe documents proving the U.S. was planning a coup were in its embassy in Tehran. Maybe the students could occupy the embassy and hold anyone they found hostage as they searched for that evidence. The next day, Khomeini encouraged the short of thinking when he declared, quote, "It is incumbent upon the students to expand their attack on America and Israel." On November 4th, 1979, the dam of American resentment burst open. 400 university students marched on the American embassy. Past mobs had been repelled, but women in this one hid bolt cutters and guns in their chadors. This got them past the front gate. The next line of defense was 15 Iranian police officers who should have been sworn to protect the embassy, but this day they all stepped aside. All that was left was a dozen Marines with strict orders not to shoot. At first, the occupation seemed peaceful. The women at the front held a sign that said, "Don't be afraid, we just want to set in." But as word spread through Tehran that the compound had been breached, thousands of angry Iranians poured in after the students. The embassy's chief of security went outside to negotiate, but the mob put a gun to his head and said they would kill him if they weren't let in. The doors were opened, the embassy fell, and the remaining staff and Marines were taken hostage. In Washington, it took a couple of days for it to dawn on everyone that the hostages would not be released quickly as they had been in past incidents. And it took a little longer to realize Khomeini, now Ayatollah Khomeini, had secured his control of Iran. And Khomeini refused to even negotiate over the hostages' fate. Since Khomeini refused to deal, Carter stepped up pressure. 15,000 pro-Khomeini Iranian students were expelled from the United States. Oil purchases from Iran were suspended, and $12 billion of Iranian assets were frozen in American banks. But Carter refused to consider war. Whenever someone suggested he mine a harbor, seize an island, or start dropping bombs, Carter would ask, "Okay, but what do we do when they start taking hostages outside one day and murdering them live on TV?" Which is a fair point. But then word leaked that Carter had told Democratic senators that, quote, "the slate would not be wiped clean by the release of hostages," which made the Iranians think Carter would attack the moment the hostages were freed, so now they felt they had to hold on to the hostages for their own protection. Carter made the bind around himself worse by saying he would not campaign for re-election so long as the hostages were in Iran, which only served to make the hostages a nightly story on the news. ABC even launched a new nightly news program, America Held Hostage, later renamed Nightline. The ratings were fire, and whenever the story seemed to die down, the savvy Iranians would leak word of a new offer or let a hostage's mother visit her child to keep the story alive in the news and keep the fire under Carter's feet from going out. As the Iranian hostage crisis passed day 150 and it became clear diplomacy was not working, Carter approved a rescue plan that was, well, let's call it a stretch. 8 helicopters were supposed to fly more than 600 miles under cover of darkness to a rendezvous point in the Iranian desert. There, they would meet 6 cargo planes carrying 120 commandos. After refueling and loading the commandos, they would fly 270 miles to a daytime hideout near Tehran, where agents would load the commandos into trucks and drive them into Tehran to the U.S. Embassy. They would then blow a hole in the compound wall, overwhelm the militants, rescue the hostages, and take them to a soccer stadium across the street where the helicopters would pick them up. They would then be flown to an abandoned airfield very close to Tehran, where more transport planes would land, sneak in, load them up, and get out. And all of this was supposed to happen without the Iranian military ever realizing anything was amiss. The number of potential failure points in that plan boggles my mind, and it went off the rails immediately. 8 choppers were sent, but 1 got lost in a sandstorm. Another had to turn back because, I kid you not, the Army pilot didn't know how to operate Navy equipment. When the remaining 6 choppers met the cargo planes and commandos at the rally points, they were shocked to find a bus of scared pilgrims out here on the highway in the middle of nowhere who they detained, and then, when they saw a truck passing through, they blew the truck up with a rocket launcher, only for its driver to leap into another car and escape. So much for stealth. U.S. Special Forces then realized that a 3rd chopper had been damaged by the sandstorm. This meant they were down to 5, and 5 were not enough to pull off the operation. So the lead recommended they abort, and Carter said, okay, abort. As the helicopters rose to evacuate, the swirling dust made visibility impossible, and one of them crashed into one of the American cargo planes, killing 8 servicemen and destroying the 2 aircraft. The bodies couldn't even be recovered. The remaining Americans fled, and Carter had to report the fiasco to the public. Iran then split up the hostages and hid them all across Tehran. There would not be a second rescue attempt. By now, it was late April, and Carter's presidency was clearly coming undone. Sure, Camp David had been nice, but the economy was still a mess. I have a historian interview coming up about that. Carter's conservative rivals were calling Panama an American retreat, and the abrupt firing of his cabinet made him appear dazed and confused. Carter's approval dropped to 23%, lower than Nixon's ever got. It didn't help that Election Day fell on the 1-year anniversary of the storming of the American embassy, and the hostages still hadn't been freed. I'll cover this election from Reagan's perspective shortly, but by the time election night rolled around, Carter was being informed, quote, tomorrow morning, a lot of blue-collar Democrats are going to wake up and vote Republican for the first time in their lives. Jimmy Carter was defeated by Ronald Reagan in a landslide. On January 20, 1977, he left the White House for the last time. Hours later, the Iranian hostages were set free. So, how had America changed during the 4 years of the Carter administration? Well, our judiciary was a lot more diverse than it ever had been. Carter tripled the number of minority judges and appointed 5 times as many women as all his predecessors had combined. Among those women, a young Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Carter tried to heal the wounds of Vietnam by pardoning all the draft dodgers his first day in office. Some loved this, some hated it. I've met some Vietnam vets who still to this day say they've never forgiven Carter for it. Carter also created FEMA. He deregulated airlines, trucking, and utilities. He passed the 1977 Clean Air Act. He established the Superfund for toxic waste cleanup. He put solar panels on the White House in a warning about global warming. And he legalized craft breweries. But the most lasting impact of Carter's presidency may have been a moment that I'm a little shocked by this wasn't even mentioned in the Carter biographies I read. The first government shutdown. If you've been listening since the beginning of this program, you may have noticed that I've never uttered the phrase government shutdown until now. There's a reason for this. There had never been one. Not because the government always passed its budget on time. For the first 200 years of the Republic, the federal government often missed its budgetary deadline, but would just keep on spending money under the previous levels until a new budget was passed and that spending was approved retroactively. That all changed in 1980, when Carter's Attorney General, a guy named Benjamin Civiletti, was asked if, in his opinion, an 1870 law that said agencies can't spend more in a year than Congress approved prevented the continued operating of the government if a budget hadn't been approved yet. Nobody had ever interpreted it that way, but Civiletti said, yeah, sure, why not? 5 days later, the first government shutdown closed the FTC when Congress and Carter got in a fight over its funding and powers. The shutdown, it was just one government agency, and it ended in less than 24 hours when Congress gave Carter what he wanted. But since that day, we have had 10 government shutdowns in the past 45 years, and many more than that threatened. Something that frequently gets in the way of Congress passing other legislation for the American people. Thanks, Civiletti. Culturally, 1977 was the year of Star Wars, awesome music, and the Apple II computer. Microsoft was 2 years old. Internationally, it was a time of increased strife and chaos. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, seeking to keep it in the Soviet orbit, and Saddam Hussein took power in Iraq, then launched an invasion of Iran, which he expected to be vulnerable due to the chaos of the revolution. We'll be hearing more from that Saddam guy down the road. As for Carter's post-presidency, well, it's been a long one. If there's one thing you know about Carter, it's probably that he spends his time building houses for Habitat for Humanity. Once a year, he joins a build and swings a hammer like everyone else. His involvement and corresponding exposure helped the organization grow into the largest nonprofit home builder on the planet. Carter also launched the Carter Center, a presidential center dedicated to, quote, waging peace, fighting disease, building hope. Carter would act as an unofficial ambassador for the United States to the delight and displeasure of later presidents. He helped avert wars in Nicaragua and Korea, but he also urged every member of the UN Security Council to vote against the first Gulf War. He kind of just did whatever he wanted. In February 2023, a 98-year-old Jimmy Carter entered hospice care. But as of recording time, May 5th, 2024, he's still alive. Rosalind, his wife of 77 years, died last November. If you're going to remember 3 things about Jimmy Carter, I would recommend Panama. Carter knew it would be unpopular, but he did the right thing and averted a potential war by negotiating the Panama Canal's return to Panama. The Camp David Accords. You almost never see presidents so directly involved in negotiations. By physically blocking Sadat and Begin from leaving and displaying original problem-solving on the spot, Carter negotiated a peace between Israel and Egypt that has held for more than 40 years. And the Iran hostage crisis. 66 Americans were taken when the embassy in Tehran was stormed, and they were held hostage for 444 days. Despite Carter's best efforts to avoid the tragedy, negotiate their release, and authorize a rescue plan. Sometimes presidents just get unlucky, and with Iran, holy smokes, Carter got unlucky. What can we learn from Carter? I'd suggest this. Mastering the details will only get you so far. It's relationships and teamwork that'll really help you achieve your goals. Carter always knew the ins and outs of every issue in front of him. He studied them assiduously, asked great questions, and was often years ahead of his time with solutions to challenges like energy crisis, climate change, and government bloat. But Carter did not do relationships. Members of both parties felt taken advantage of and ignored. Joe Biden, who was first elected to the Senate in 1973, summed it up nicely when he said, "Nixon had his enemies list, and President Carter has his friends list. I'm on his friends list, and I don't know which is worse." You're not going to be successful if people are saying things like that. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and pay those to the show, and thank you so much to everyone who has contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. The primary biography for today's episode was His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life by Jonathan Alter. In our next episode, I'll talk with Jonathan Alter about the 1976 Dark Horse presidential campaign that put Jimmy Carter in office, and how Carter's failure to develop a successful working relationship with Democratic leaders in Congress undermined his administration and some of his greatest priorities. That's next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.